how ironic. The Immortals stood at the boundary of the vast plaza, their beautiful and youthful figures drowning in the stark darkness cast by the tall buildings of the Eternal City. Only their eyes glistened like cold silver stars, reflecting the light of the magnificent spires. They seemed to be studying the Shadow Legion with curious smiles, but that was an illusion. By now, Sunny knew that their smiles were merely masks that these abominations wore to resemble humans. There was nothing human about them, though. Now that he could see them clearer, he noticed things that had escaped him during the frenetic battle with the fiend who had welcomed them to the city. Something moved under their supple skin from time to time, as if straining to escape, and their breathtaking faces turned monstrous for a split second now and then. Before, Sunny had assumed that these abominations took human shape to hide their harrowing nature. But now, he realized that they looked human through no effort or will of their own. On the contrary, the beautiful Immortals were endlessly straining to become monsters. It was just that every time their bodies began to mutate into grotesque abominations, the same sorcery that granted them endless life returned their flesh to its original form. So, they were not fiends who pretended to be humans. Instead, they were monsters trapped in human bodies against their will. For all eternity. This eerie contradiction made his skin crawl, and considering that the skin of these fallen Immortals literally crawled, that only disturbed Sunny more. While it seemed like the beautiful youths were observing the Shadow Legion with curiosity, in fact, they were simply waiting for more of them to arrive. A few figures turned into a crowd, and a crowd turned into a swarm. The swarm flowed onto the plaza like a tide. Sunny inhaled deeply. Here we go. His mind spun like a wheel. What was the best way to fight these monsters? How could he achieve victory, and do it in a way that was the most beneficial for him and the Shadow Legion? Sunny considered what he needed to do for a brief moment and quickly came up with an answer. Funnily enough, it was almost offensively simple. At the beginning of his journey as an awakened, Sunny had mostly relied on his skill and combat intelligence to survive. His technique, physical prowess, and state of mind had decided the outcome of battles. Later, however, things changed. As both Sunny and his enemies grew more powerful, most of his victories were earned by his wit and his soul arsenal instead. Skill and martial prowess were still of vital importance, of course, serving as the irreplaceable foundation of everything, but he won countless battles by using obscure enchantments of inconspicuous memories in unexpected ways. The outcome of battles he fought these days, meanwhile, was often decided by more mystical forces. Who was stronger, whose power was more versatile? Who knew how to use it best? In the clashes of deities, the very concepts of what they were often played the most important role. Facing the swarm of immortal abominations, though, Sunny realized that he had made a full circle. Since the conquest of the Eternal City would come down to a battle of attrition, Sunny had to minimize his losses. And to minimize his losses, he had to adhere to a wholly primitive set of tactical values. There was no trick to overcoming this trial, just mundane warfare. The greatest advantage Sunny wielded was that his Shadow Legion was an organized combat force, while the fallen Immortals, while dreadfully powerful, were merely a monstrous mob. So, he had to make sure that his shades fought with the skill and technique of exalted warriors, and that all of them displayed flawless cohesion. Beyond that, the tried and tested rules of military strategy would be of utmost importance. He had to prevent the enemy from flanking his army, for example, and use terrain to his advantage. Whenever possible, he would have to reduce his losses by building or usurping fortifications. Even the simplest elements of warfare, like battle formations, would once again become vital. Google see novel Fire.net. It was a far cry from the conceptual battles and clashes of opposing aspects, but it was also familiar territory. So, Sunny was able to adjust his mentality swiftly. There were mere moments left before the fallen Immortals descended on the battle formation of the Shadow Legion. And in those few moments, Sunny made a decision. With the nature of the battle for the Eternal City being what it is, his ability to finally control each of his shades was more important than ever. He had already achieved great success in that regard thanks to Mind Weave, but even that was not enough. So, taking a deep breath, he summoned one more shade. The Rat King was resting in the lightless expanse of his soul now, which meant that Sunny could call upon a different sacred shadow. As the fallen immortals rushed forward, their bodies rippling and bursting into torrents of eviscerating flesh, a colossal silhouette appeared above the plaza. Then, a titanic black moth opened its vast wings, perched atop the main tower of the dark castle and looming over its walls. Sunny had summoned the shadow of Puppeteer Moth, the spirit of doubt. As it regarded the plaza with its enormous black eyes, countless strands of ethereal black silk shot forward, spreading through the air like a spiderweb so thin as to almost be invisible. Each of those strings buried itself in the back of a shade, connecting them all to the puppeteer. At the same time, one of Sunny's incarnations turned into a shadow and wrapped itself around the sacred shade, sharing its senses. Ah! Sunny shuddered, overwhelmed by the feeling of fusing with the shadow of a sacred being. It was too strange, too vast, too great for him to fathom fully. But he did fathom the connection between the puppeteer and the soldiers of the Shadow Legion. Like that, Sunny gained nearly flawless control of his undying army. The flood of slithering, hungry flesh collided with the vanguard of the Shadow Legion. A vast swath of the beautiful plaza exploded into a cloud of stone shards, then was restored to pristine condition, then was destroyed again. The fallen immortals each possessed the power of a great one, bending the very fabric of the world with their profane will. However, the enemies they faced were not weak either. There, at the forefront of the great battle formation, the shades of the Black Millipedes and the Ember Queen flowed forward like a dark tide, unleashing their fury upon the abominable fiends. The Millipedes were connected to the puppeteer through the ethereal strands of black silk, and through the puppeteer to Sunny. Suddenly, he could sense and command numerous monstrous, segmented bodies. Sunny had a myriad of sharp legs and a myriad of even sharper mandibles, using them to rip and tear the flesh of the immortal swarm to shreds. The prisoners of the Eternal City were unmade, and then restored once again. Countless shades were vanquished, returning into the dark embrace of his soul. A moment later, the tide of millipedes rippled and changed its behavior. Instead of flowing forward like a tide of chilling, bestial fury, the millipede formed an unbreakable wall from their glossy black chitin. Those of them who had been cast by beings of higher classes rose above that wall, spitting torrents of corrosive black acid at the advancing immortals. For a few moments, the plaza was drowned by acrid smoke. Then, segments of the chitin wall were breached or torn apart, and the mayhem continued. Sunny observed the battle through numerous eyes and through his own 4 pairs of them, as well. "I've noticed something peculiar." Jet's voice was strangely calm despite the terrifying spectacle happening in front of him. Sunny raised an eyebrow. "What?" She looked around. Her gaze lingered on Saint, Slayer, Nightmare, the gargantuan shape of serpent wrapped around one of the dark castle's towers, and the lumbering figure of Fiend far below. "You seem to be holding back." Sunny forced out a smile. "I need to establish a baseline to know how swift my shades can be destroyed by these things. Once I know that, I will know how to plan for future battles better." She frowned slightly. "Are the losses you are suffering worth it?" "Get full chapters from n.delfire.net," he grimaced. "That is something I need to find out, as well." Sunny was not going to sacrifice too many shades in pursuit of vital information, though. He was definitely not going to sacrifice the Ember Queen and her more powerful champions, so, when the wall of chitin came close to collapsing, he moved one to the next test. 3 of his incarnations stepped through the shadows and fused with him, augmenting his power. Feels great. This was the strongest he had been after the final battle at Godgrave, so Sunny almost felt like himself again. Enjoying the feeling of ferocious power running through his veins, he cast his attention to something else. The moment 4 of his incarnations were reunited, 4 links of the curse fused, as well. Instantly, its power soared, and his did, too. In fact, it worked so well that Sunny was stunned for a brief moment. "Oh. I see what is happening." It was the absence of light enchantment doing its work. That enchantment was supposed to grant Sunny more power when he was surrounded by deep shadows, and where would he find shadows that were deeper than those that dwelled at the bottom of the storm sea, in the abyssal darkness that had never been touched even by an echo of sunlight? perhaps only in the shadow realm. Spending a split second to come to terms with his immense potency, Sunny inhaled slowly, and then activated 2 of the 3 core enchantments of the curse, Shadow Flame and Mercy of Shadow. Instantly, the augmentation he was enjoying was transferred to the champion shades of the Black Millipede tribe. At the same time, more of his deathly will was expressed through them, as well. The cadence of the battle changed. Far below, the rate at which his shades were being destroyed increased drastically. At the same time, the rate at which the fallen immortals were obliterated increased. Not that it mattered much, considering that they were revived before too long. Sunny frowned. The effect was significant. But that was because there were relatively few of the immortal nightmare creatures on the outskirts of the Eternal City. Once they delved deeper into its streets, the scale of the battles would increase, and therefore, the impact of the curse would become less pronounced. But that was valuable information in and of itself, because it helped him understand what kind of engagements he had to avoid, and what kind he had to force. Jet sighed. Are you done gathering information, perhaps? Sunny lingered for a few moments and then sighed. Yes. That should do, for now. It seemed as if Slayer had been waiting to hear these exact words. A moment after Sunny spoke them, she was already drawing her bow, the tip of her arrow swelling with blinding light. At the same time, Saint turned into a torrent of darkness and rushed toward the battle. Nightmare leaped into the air, while Serpent slithered to the ground like a river of onyx scales. Fiend simply plummeted into the shadows, stepping through them to appear just beyond the mass of shadow millipedes. He did not manage to disappear before Sunny stirred and shouted, his voice full of concern, "Don't eat them." The first thing he had thought about when presented with the problem of containing the fallen immortals was feeding them to either fiend or mimic. However, the dwellers of the Eternal City were too eerie, too unnerving. Sunny was worried that swallowing one of these creatures would allow it to infect his shadows. Observing the Shadow Legion stir, Jet asked in a calm tone, "So, are we joining the fun, as well?" Sunny looked at her and smiled. "Of course. We wouldn't want to miss something so memorable, would we?" The silent ranks of the Shadow Legion stirred under the walls of the dark castle. The cadence of the battle changed as the black flood moved forward, flowing across the shattered ground. The titanic figures of Goliath and the defiled Seeker lumbered above the black tide of dead soldiers, making the plaza shake with each step. The myriad threads of ethereal black silk trembled, forming a vast spiderweb. The fallen immortals were still engaged in a battle against the Ember Queen and her millipede swarm. Individually, each of them was more powerful than an average shade under Sunny's command. However, in this battle at least, the numerical advantage was on his side. So, the rulers of the Eternal City rapidly found themselves flanked. Bestial shades of Godgrave had flanked them from the left, while the Shadow Wolves and the Obsidian Wasps had flanked them from the right. At the same time, the Shadow of Dayron led the shades of human saints into a frontal assault to support the Ember Queen. Clad in the armor forged by the Shadow of the King of Swords, the Shadow of the King of Twilight descended upon the immortals of the Eternal City like a storm. His polearm carved a bloody path through the mass of slivering flesh, causing the thunderous roars of destructive impacts to roll across the battlefield. It was somewhat ironic, but in this battle between great and supreme beings, those who were only a step away from becoming deities, the mundane laws of strategy were just as important as mystical matters. The inhabitants of the Eternal City might have been immortals, but they still could not overcome the dire disadvantage of being attacked from the flank. Attacked from several directions at the same time, they began to falter. A few seconds later, a blinding explosion bloomed among the fallen immortals, turning hundreds of them to dust. That was Slayer's arrow finding its mark. Fiend emerged from the shadows of the battlefield, towering above it like a steel colossus forged in the depths of hell. A plume of red flame escaped from his maw, turning a vast area in front of him into a blazing inferno, and his razor-sharp claws severed countless bodies in half. Saint rose from a vast torrent of darkness. Despite towering more than 10 meters above ground, she moved with her usual grace. The weight of her firm steps, however, was crushing enough to send cracks running through the stone plates covering the plaza. Serpent plunged into the grotesque mass of fallen immortals, rampaging among them like a formless, ever-changing spirit of death. It took whatever shape was most suitable for destroying the adversary, and remained in its own serpentine form when there was no better choice. Nightmare tore their monstrous flesh with his horns, hooves, and fangs. Jed observed the awesome spectacle of the distressing battle with a calm gaze. She sighed quietly and then jumped onto the parapet of the dark castle's rampart. The wind sent her raven-black hair dancing, and wisps of chilling mist surrounded her lithe figure. "Have you come up with a way to actually contain these fiends yet?" Sunny gave her a neutral look. "I'm working on it." She grinned and raised a fist into the air. "Work hard." With that, she turned into mist and disappeared from view, as if dispelled by the wind. Read complete version only at novel.ir.net. Soon enough, a frightening wraith of icy mist appeared among the fallen immortals, severing their repulsive bodies with a ghostly scythe. Sunny let out a satisfied sigh. "Well then, it's time for me to go, too." He took a few steps back, lowered his body, and then dashed forward. Racing the parapet of the battlements, he jumped and soared into the sky. Half a dozen moments later, Sunny plummeted to the ground like a dark comet, falling into the very middle of the immortal swarm. His impact made the entire island quake, and a violent explosion tore everything around him to shreds. A devastating shockwave rolled outward, breaking the bodies of undying abominations and sending them to the ground. Those who were near the explosion were simply reduced to ash. When the dust settled, there was a vast crater in the spot where Sunny had landed, surrounded by a wide, empty area. Standing in the middle of that chaos and watching calmly as the swirling flakes of ash slowly coalesced into human bodies, he smiled. "See? I am working on it hard." The helmet of the jade mantle hid his face, and a black shield wove itself out of shadows on his arm. "Serpent." The colossal shadow slithered his way and rippled, then turned into a black sword that fell into his hand. Having suffered from how rapid and lethal the flesh tendrils of a fallen immortal were, Sunny had abandoned his usual odachi in favor of a one-handed sword and a shield. He was proficient in this form of combat as well, naturally, he just did not use it often. Now that he did, however, Sunny felt a strong and unexplainable impulse to strike the rim of his shield twice. "I think I am starting to understand why Saint does it." He was surrounded by the immortal fiends by then. Before, one of them had been enough to make Sunny sweat. Now, there were dozens of them around him and behind them, hundreds more. But Sunny was not the same as he had been then. At the moment, he was enhanced by 3 of his shadows and wielded 4 links of the curse on top of that. The jade mantle and its underworld armament enchantment strengthened the shadowbound charm, as the absence of light enchantment of the charm empowered Sunny. The sword he wielded, meanwhile, was the manifestation of a supreme titan serpent, his slaying blade. So, his strength had become more unfathomably ferocious, making it feel like the world was straining to contain him. Sunny smiled. "Come. Today, I will make you regret being immortal." Brandishing his sword, he lunged forward. Sunny had dismissed the marvelous mimic from the forgotten shore while 4 of his incarnations were inside, and then summoned it to the Eternal City. That was how 5 of his avatars ended up at the bottom of the storm sea at the same time. He called upon the Shadow Legion and summoned the puppeteer to gain a flawless measure of control over his shades. Mindweave allowed him to issue countless commands at the same time, so he could control all of his shades individually, but at the end of the day, he was still issuing orders, with the Great Moth controlling the shades like marionettes, though Sunny could do more. Instead of giving endless commands to make his shades do what he wanted there to, he only needed to command one, and as long as an incarnation of his was wrapped peck around the puppeteer, the entire Shadow Legion became no different from an extension of his body. That meant that he was not limited to giving orders anymore, he could control his shades like he did his body. The cohesion of the Shadow Legion was therefore nearly flawless now. And more than that, every shade, even those of mindless beasts, could fight with the same skill and technique Sunny possessed. Needless to say, his mastery of shadow dance was instrumental in controlling thousands of varied bodies skillfully. Armed with these advantages, Sunny engaged the fallen immortals of the Eternal City in battle. Their crushing collective will washed over him, and was repelled by his own with the help of the curse. But that was merely the boring part, the necessary part. Now, however, was his time to have fun. No, really, what is wrong with me? Is this my idea of fun? Encased in the fearsome carapace of the jade mantle, wielding the soul serpent, and empowered by the curse, Sunny plunged into the swarm of monstrous, immortal abominations. His shield was broken under the avalanche of fleshy tendrils, but instantly restored itself as Sunny manifested more shadows into its form. His slaying blade cut the fallen immortals down one after another, but failed to kill them. His armor remained unscathed, for now, both protecting his body and empowering it through the curse. Sunny struggled a little with not getting drunk on his fierce strength. In that moment, he truly felt like a demigod. His power had transcended the mundane, forcing the world to bend and change shape around his movements. Naturally, there was a wall standing in his way. That wall was the will of his enemies, but while Sunny could not demolish it completely, he could overcome it enough to not feel too restrained. The will technique he had been developing for a long while now helped him to achieve that. So, yes, he was having fun. The battle was a little exhilarating. It had been a long time since he used that much of his power, and even more since he had been matched this well against an adversary. His legion was battling the mob of detestable immortals all around him, and he was barely staying alive while cutting down his foes. It was in that narrow gap between triumph and the cold defeat of death that the thrill of a battle lay. Best of all, his enemies were immortal. So, he could kill them as many times as he wanted. Naturally, the fact that they were immortal was also infinitely troubling. What exactly must I do here? Deflecting a lightning-quick tendril of repugnant flesh with his shield, Sunny pierced the body of a fallen immortal and sliced it apart. A split second later, he was already moving to avoid the next lethal strike while raising his sword to deliver a rapid downward slash. He was doing well in the battle against the fallen immortals, and the Shadow Legion was confidently overcoming them as well. But these were eternal beings. After all, no matter how many times they were destroyed, they would endlessly rise from the dead. If nothing changed, the scales of battle would begin to favor them soon, and eventually, they would swallow both him and his shades. He needed to find a way to contain them. The first idea Sunny had was to feed the undying fiends to either fiend or mimic. However, he was wary of that method since it could poison and destroy his shadows. With how indestructible these nightmare creatures were, there was no telling what would happen if one of them was consumed. Luckily, there were other potential solutions, as well. The simplest one was to toss the fallen immortals into the Shadow Realm. After all, immortality was not an inherent trait of these fiends. It was the eternal city that kept reviving them. So, moving them to somewhere else was supposed to solve the problem, especially if that place was the realm of death. However, there were two problems with this idea. First, Sunny would have to drag every nightmare creature into the Shadow Lantern personally, by pulling them into the shadows. Second, he was not sure that it was even possible. Something told Sunny that the barrier created by Dayron would prevent the fallen immortals from leaving the Eternal City, even in that unconventional way. What else, then? He could potentially use the puppeteer to take the immortals under control. And yet, that was not guaranteed to work either. After all, the Great Moth was merely a shadow of the spirit of doubt. It did not possess a will of its own, so subjugating creatures of the great rank was unlikely to work. Apart from that, the Eternal City could simply return the immortals to a state prior to subjugation. Well, then. Sunny continued to fight, dividing his mind between countless shades and his own body. For original chapters, go to novelfire.net. There was one way that could work, even if it demanded more effort to implement. Yes, that should do the trick. He smiled darkly. Before Sunny could subdue the fallen immortals in that way, though, they had to be thoroughly defeated. The Shadow Legion had its work cut out for it. A world-shaking roar thundered above the battlefield, and Sunny felt cold terror shackle his limbs like a vice. His movements slowed, and the foundation of his will seemed to crumble. Instantly, tendrils of flesh moved faster than lightning and shot past his defenses to pierce his limbs, jerking him in 4 different directions to pull his body apart. Gritting his teeth, Sunny steeled his mind and shook off the mental attack that had weakened him. Was it even a mental attack, if it affected his very spirit? And strained his muscles. Instead of being pulled apart, he overpowered the four immortals who were trying to quarter him into the dark embrace of shadows. There, his vast and shapeless form tore their abominable shadows apart, scattering them across the boundless darkness. A moment later, he assumed a physical shape once more, rising from the bloodied rubble with a cold expression on his hidden face. The breached surface of the jade mantle was already repairing itself, and drops of crimson blood were falling from his sword. What was that roar? Casting his senses into the depths of the Eternal City, he felt a massive shadow barreling toward the plaza. Then, a second roar crashed into the Shadow Legion, and an enormous tiger with glistening silver fur and golden stripes leaped into the mass of fallen immortals, its bestial eyes shining with a beautiful glow. In the next moment, the flesh on the back of the giant tiger rippled and bulged with repugnant growths, which then exploded into a forest of deadly tendrils. The tendrils shot forward, piercing numerous shades and tearing them apart. Sunny's gaze turned somber. So, the Eternal City was not populated by immortal humans alone. It seemed like there had been immortal creatures here, as well, and all of them were now twisted by corruption. The abominable beast plunged into the battle formation of the Shadow Legion, shattering it. With every leap, the graceful figure of the silver tiger grew more monstrous and misshapen, slowly transforming it into a nightmarish mass of slithering flesh. Before the abominations could deal too much damage, however, an enormous hand forged of blackened metal rose from the darkness and grabbed its neck, slicing it open. As a waterfall of blood poured to the ground, Fiend emerged from the shadows, raising the giant tiger into the air. The obliterating tendrils scraped against his mental carapace without being able to pierce it, and as infernal flames ignited in his eyes, wisps of smoke escaped through the tears in the abomination's fur. Sunny focused on repairing the battle formation of the Shadow Legion, feeling a little disappointed that he could not deal with the abominable tiger himself. Well, he could, in theory. After all, the damn thing was just as immortal as its human kin, so all he had to do was command Fiend to retreat. But that would be a bit too unhinged a decision, even for him. Raising his shield, Sunny moved forward. Slowly at first, then faster and faster, the Shadow Legion gained an upper hand over the disorganized mob of fallen immortals. Despite all their great power, the denizens of the Eternal City seemed more like mindless beasts than people, so they failed to overcome the flawless cohesion and discipline of the Silent Shades. Of course, their inferior numbers played the decisive role. Eventually, Sunny gained complete control of the battlefield. The grotesque creatures were still refusing to die, but at some point, he managed to divide and isolate them from each other. Once that happened, the losses of the Shadow Legion almost ceased. When the fallen immortals were imprisoned in a ruthless loop of being killed, reviving, and immediately being slain again, he proceeded to the next step. The actions of the Shades changed. Instead of cutting the fallen immortals down, the Shadow Legion attempted to restrain them. At first, Sunny failed to contain many of the abominations, causing more shades to be destroyed. Containing a nightmare creature was much harder than killing it, after all. But eventually, he succeeded. Using the puppeteer and his legion of shades, Sunny slowly managed to restrain each of the corrupted immortals. That was how the first battle he fought in the Eternal City ended. Sunny stood among the rubble, breathing heavily. The plaza around him was completely destroyed, and all the ornate buildings around it had turned to ruins. The dark castle towered behind him, casting a deep shadow on the scene of utter devastation. Soon enough, though, the plaza returned to its spotless beauty, and the ornate buildings assembled themselves from the rubble. The black waters of the storm sea rolled far above his head, glistening with reflected light. Dismissing his helmet, Sunny inhaled deeply and wiped the sweat off his brow. Jet appeared in a gust of cold wind, making him shiver. She seemed unscathed, if a little tired. "Ah, I am worried." Fighting an immortal opponent was already bad enough, but it was woefully worse for Jet after all. She needed a constant influx of soul essence to stay alive. Since they could not really kill these abominations, she could not receive any essence either. All she could do was waste it without getting anything back. Would Jet even survive a prolonged confrontation for the Eternal City? Sunny sighed. Looking around, at the silent figures of shades who were struggling to hold the abominable immortals down, Jed asked in a grim tone, "What now?" Sunny hesitated for a short while, then answered evenly, "Now, we show these hellspawn creatures a different, far more cruel hell." With that, his shadows flowed off his body to the ground, and then assumed their corporeal forms. The fifth incarnation stepped out of the shadows, as well, having left the puppeteer. There was the sound of adamantine hooves ringing on the stone, and Nightmare approached them, blood dripping from its steel fangs. Sunny inhaled deeply, and then looked at his steed. "Sing them a lullaby, Nightmare." With that, all 5 of Sunny's avatars turned into shadows and wrapped themselves around the black stallion. Nightmare's crimson eyes ignited with terrifying flames. This chapter is updated by novelfire.net. Chapter 2638. A Maze of Dreadful Dreams. Turn off. Reset. The fallen immortals of the Eternal City could not be destroyed, but they had to be contained. So, of all the measures available to Sunny, Nightmare and his dream curse seemed like the best choice. Dream curse ability description. This shadow is a master of a lesser dream domain. It is capable of lulling living beings to sleep and imprisoning their souls in a labyrinth of nightmares. The souls destroyed within the nightmare maze feed the shadow. The more powerful the shadow grows, the faster and further the dream curse spreads. It was an insidious and terrifying power, made only more eerie by how closely it resembled some traits of the nightmare spell. It was also what made Nightmare a terror. No 2 terrors were alike, but there were similarities between all of them. Just like tyrants were usually distinguished by their ability to rule lesser creatures and control territories, terrors were distinguished by their ability to influence the world and spread. They were more akin to frightening phenomena than singular beings, and it was that escalating nature of their influence that made them so perilous. Curiously enough, most titans did not seem to possess a similar kind of spreading influence, and while some were followed by swarms of nightmare creatures, they did not really rule or care to rule them. The abominations were simply drawn to them like crows that followed slaughtering armies, while titans usually regarded them with indifferent disinterest. They were aloof and solitary creatures that seemed to exist in a world of their own. Strangely, that seemed like a downgrade compared to the vast swarms of detestable minions that served tyrants or the exponentially expanding influence of terrors, and yet, nobody who had ever faced a titan on a battlefield would think them weaker than beings of a lesser class. The process of terrors evolving to Tions was shrouded in mystery and largely unknown, but there was a reason why becoming a titan was the final and most difficult step that a creature could take on the path of evolution. There was also a reason why another, less frequently used word to describe titans was calamities. That said, titans were exceedingly rare. And while terrors were rare as well, Sunny had suffered far more while encountering the few he did meet. Some of the most harrowing foes he had ever clashed with were terrors: the Soul Devourer, the Terror of the Crimson Spire, the Terror of LO49, Skinwalker, that odious thieving bird, and Nightmare. The dream curse could spread like a plague, both consuming his prey and making the tenebrous steed stronger. It was insidiously effective, as well, capable of subduing even creatures that were far stronger than its source. That was how Sunny had collected an army of great nightmare creatures in Godgrave and dropped a cursed devil on Mordred's head. Dreadfully of all, the dream curse was subtle. Its victims did not even know that they were under attack until they were lulled to sleep and locked in an inescapable labyrinth of nightmares, and by then, it was already too late. That was the reason why Nightmare could prey on abominations of higher ranks than him. Even if the dream curse failed to lull a creature to sleep at first, he could continue to subtly influence them until their defenses were weakened, and they could not resist anymore. However, there was a limit even to that insidious power, naturally. Nightmare was merely a transcendent terror, after all. It had taken Sunny and him close to 2 years to gradually assemble the swarm of great nightmare creatures in Godgrave, and it had not been an easy feat either. The fallen immortals from this district of the Eternal City alone were greater in number than those abominations, and each of them was furiously powerful. There would be numerous more before the expedition was over, and Sunny did not have years to slowly subdue them all. So, he was not entirely confident that Nightmare would be able to lull them all to sleep. Even if he could, there was no guarantee that his steed would be able to contain these monsters in the maze of nightmares indefinitely. Sunny himself had escaped that maze once, after all, shattering its walls during his battle against Nightmare. Those walls were made from the nightmares that served the Black Stallion. Nightmare planted their seeds into the hearts of living beings and then harvested them, turning them into his minions. The fallen immortals would endure quite a few, no doubt, but they would dream their own nightmares as well. In the end, Nightmare would have to subjugate the dreams of ancient immortals faster than his minions were destroyed, building his own legion of nightmares terrifying enough to contain them. Subduing the grotesque abominations and keeping them subdued, these were the two problems facing Sunny, and he was not sure that a transcendent terror could manage both, at least not in a timely manner. Get full chapters from novelfire.net. But while Nightmare had not evolved to a new rank since Godgrave, Sunny had. He had grown stronger in numerous aspects apart from rank, as well. And 5 of his incarnations were here. With 5 supreme shadows augmenting Nightmare, he had a good chance of solving at least the first problem infecting the restrained immortals with the dream curse. From that point onward, though, Nightmare would be on his own. No one but the Dark Destrier himself could keep his victims lost in the labyrinth of harrowing dreams. Come on, Nightmare. While many shades struggled to restrain the fallen immortals, Nightmare lowered his head and cast his terrifying, crimson gaze at them. Sunny could not see the dream curse spreading, and he could not even sense it. But the world around them suddenly felt dark and terrifying, and an eerie chill seemed to permeate the air. Far above, perched atop the dark castle, the puppeteer moved its antennae, as if wary of something. Jet glanced around with a slight frown, her gorgeous face growing a little paler. Time seemed to stretch, flowing slowly. But then, eventually, there was a subtle change to the strange and eerie scene in front of him. Just a few meters away from Nightmare, a gorgeous youth was sprawled on the ground, held firmly in place by black chains and the mandibles of several obsidian wasps. Despite his calm and benevolent expression, the immortal was straining to free himself forcefully, the stone around him cracking and mending itself without stop. Gradually, though, his struggles seemed to grow less intense. His gaze grew dimmer, and his eyelids grew heavy. The young man blinked a few times, his eyes remaining closer for a bit longer each time. And then, they did not open. His struggle ceased. He was asleep. Sunny let out a relieved sigh. It seems to be working. After that fist success, numerous more followed, as well. Soon enough, an eerie silence enveloped the plaza. The shades were standing without movement, and on the ground between them, the distressing immortals of the Eternal City were sleeping peacefully, the black currents of the storm sea glistening with silver light in the sky above them. Or possibly not so peacefully, at all.